By the seventh morning, I stopped pretending the flowers were being left at the wrong house. The first had been a pale pink rose, laid carefully on the top step of my porch. No vase, no ribbon, no note. The next morning, there was a sprig of lavender, then a yellow tulip, then something white and delicate I couldn't identify. By day 7, I had started opening my front door before I made coffee. That irritated me more than I care to admit. I'd moved to Cape May 6 months earlier, after retiring from hospital administration and finally admitting that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in the suburban house where my marriage had quietly died. My children thought buying a cottage near the coast was impulsive. At 63, I thought I had earned the right to be impulsive once. The house was small, weathered, and surrounded by what the realtor generously called an established garden. I called it botanical anarchy. My plan was to clear most of it out, put in something manageable, and enjoy the peace I'd worked 38 years to afford. Then somebody started leaving flowers on my porch. By the 12th morning, curiosity had defeated dignity. I installed a doorbell camera. The next day, at 5:47 in the morning, I saw him. An older man in a navy jacket walked up my path carrying a single red flower. He wasn't creeping around. He didn't look nervous. He simply climbed the steps, placed the flower beside my door, looked toward the garden for several seconds, and left. I watched the recording 3 times. He was probably in his late 60s, tall, silver hair, broad shoulders that suggested he'd once been bigger than he was now. And, inconveniently, handsome. I immediately reminded myself that handsome strangers leaving unexplained objects at your house before sunrise were not necessarily romantic. The following morning, he did it again. So I left a note beneath a small stone on the porch. If you're going to leave flowers at my house, you could at least tell me your name. The next morning there was no flower. At 8:15, someone knocked. He was even taller in person. "I'm Daniel Hart," he said. I crossed my arms. Should that explain anything? His mouth twitched. "No, but you asked my name." I liked him slightly less for being funny. "Why are you leaving flowers on my porch?" His expression changed. Not dramatically. He simply looked past me for a moment, toward the hallway, as if the answer was somewhere inside my house. "They're not exactly for you." That was not the answer I'd expected. And, embarrassingly, I discovered I'd expected something. Daniel glanced toward the garden. "My wife planted most of what's back there." I said nothing. "We owned this house 30 years ago, Margaret and I." His wife had died 4 years earlier. Before that, cancer had forced them to sell the cottage and move closer to their daughter in Philadelphia. The flowers were part of an old private ritual. For 30 days leading up to their wedding anniversary, Daniel had always brought Margaret 1 flower each morning, sometimes from their own garden, sometimes from somewhere else. After she died, he began coming back here during those same 30 days. The house had been empty the previous 2 years. Then I bought it. "You knew someone lived here," I said. "Yes, and you kept doing it." He looked genuinely ashamed. I told myself I'd stop after the first morning. What happened? I came back the second morning. I laughed before I meant to. That was the first thing about Daniel that unsettled me. Not the flowers. The fact that I found myself understanding him. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. If you're enjoying this story so far, tap the like button. It really helps more people find these stories. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I'd love to know what city, state, or country you're listening from. Now, let me take you back to what happened next. He apologized and said he wouldn't return. Then, on his way down the steps, he noticed the orange stakes scattered across the front garden. "Landscaping?" he asked. "I'm having most of it removed." He stopped. I expected protest. Instead, he nodded once. "It's your house now." That sentence stayed with me. 2 days later, I found an old metal plant marker, half buried beneath ivy. The writing had faded, but one word was still visible. Margaret. I stared at it longer than necessary. Then I did something I still can't fully explain. I called Daniel. I want to know what's actually back there before I destroy it. He arrived the next morning carrying gardening gloves, 2 notebooks, and coffee for himself. Nothing for me. I looked at his cup. You didn't bring me one? You spent 20 minutes explaining how badly people make your coffee. I did not spend 20 minutes. 18 then. That was how it began. Not with seduction, not even with romance, with weeds. Daniel could identify almost everything in that garden. Peonies, iris, hydrangeas, clematis, rose varieties whose names sounded like wealthy British women. I spent 38 years running hospital departments, so I wasn't accustomed to admitting ignorance gracefully. Daniel enjoyed that. You don't like not knowing things, he said one morning. I like learning. No, you like already knowing. I pointed my pruning shears at him. Careful. He smiled. Over the next few weeks, the garden became less wild, and Daniel became less of a stranger. He told me about Margaret without turning her into a saint. They'd fought about money. She hated that he worked too much. He hated that she adopted abandoned animals without consulting him. Once, she brought home a 3-legged dog while he was away on business. What did you do? Complained for 12 years. You kept the dog 12 years? Best dog I ever had. I found myself laughing more around him than I had in a long time. He learned about my divorce slowly. There had been no dramatic betrayal. My husband simply became absent while still sitting across from me at dinner. One night, after 32 years, he told me he'd been unhappy for a long time. The thing that stayed with me wasn't that he left. It was that he'd apparently been leaving for years while I hadn't noticed. After that, I became very good at not needing anybody. Daniel understood that before I ever said it directly. One afternoon, we were pulling vines from an old wooden trellis when he said, "You ask for help only after you've already tried everything yourself. That's called independence. I think you've confused independence with refusing witnesses." I looked at him. You always this annoying? Only when I'm right. He was repairing one of the loose boards when the wood slipped and cut his palm. It wasn't serious, but I brought him inside anyway. I cleaned the cut at my kitchen sink while he stood beside me. His hand was warm in mine. That should have meant nothing. Instead, when I finished wrapping the bandage, neither of us moved. Daniel looked at me, not at my hair, not at my mouth, at me. I let go first. A few days later, his daughter Emily came by while Daniel was out buying replacement lumber. She was 50, bright-eyed, and clearly amused to find her father spending his mornings with another woman. "He talks about you," she said. I pretended to concentrate on my iced tea. "I'm sure he talks about the garden. Mostly he talks about how you argue with him. That sounds more accurate." Her smile faded slightly. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. "He doesn't come here because he can't let go of Mom." I looked at her. This was the last place I remember them being really happy together. After Mom got sick, everything became hospitals and appointments. Dad comes here because he remembers who he was before all of that. I understood that better than I wanted to. A week later, Daniel found the roses. They were buried behind a collapsed section of trellis and years of overgrowth. He spent several days cutting everything back. Then one morning, I stepped outside and found 3 dark pink roses open in the sun. Daniel was already standing there. He didn't say anything. I'd never seen him speechless before. "Margaret planted those the summer Emily graduated," he finally said. His voice was rough. Without thinking, I took his hand. He looked down at our fingers, then back at me. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. That was the moment I knew I was in trouble. Not because I wanted him, because I cared whether he wanted me. The question sat between us for several days before I finally asked, We were standing beside the roses when I said, "Do I remind you of her?" Daniel looked surprised. "Margaret? Who else?" He considered it, then said, "No." The answer hurt more than it had any right to. I stepped back. "Well, that's clear enough." He frowned. "Laura, what? You don't remind me of Margaret. I heard you. That's one of the things I like about you." I stopped. Daniel moved closer, though not enough to touch me. Margaret hated confrontation. "You appear to schedule it recreationally." Despite myself, I laughed. She thought carefully before she spoke. "You sometimes begin speaking and discover your opinion halfway through. You're doing a terrible job here." "I'm not finished." His expression softened. "You're funny. You're stubborn. You pretend you don't need anybody, then worry about everybody. You make terrible coffee and excellent decisions, usually." I looked at him. "And I don't come here because you remind me of my wife." That was the first time I allowed myself to believe him. A few nights later, I invited him to dinner. Nothing elaborate, salmon, potatoes, and a bottle of wine neither of us knew enough about to criticize properly. Afterward, we sat on the porch until the air cooled. Daniel stood to leave, then stopped at the top step. "Laura, yes? Can I kiss you?" At 63, you would think a woman could answer that question without feeling 17. Apparently not. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. He kissed me slowly. No urgency, no performance. Just a warm hand against my cheek and a kiss that made me aware of how long I'd gone without being touched by someone who was paying attention. When we separated, Daniel smiled. So what? Disappointed? Undecided?" He laughed. That kiss didn't solve anything. If anything, it complicated the part I hadn't been thinking about. The next morning, I looked at the garden plans spread across my dining table. Over the previous weeks, I'd started asking myself what Daniel would want kept. The roses, the iris, Margaret's old herb bed. Then I realized something uncomfortable. I was about to make my new home into a memorial because I was afraid changing it might change how Daniel saw me. That wasn't love. That was disappearing. So I told him I needed to finish the garden myself. Daniel didn't argue. He just nodded. "Probably should have been yours all along." For 2 weeks, I worked with the landscaper without asking Daniel's opinion. We removed entire sections. We kept others. I planted things Margaret never would have chosen because I liked them. I painted the old bench blue. Daniel had once told me Margaret hated blue garden furniture. That may have influenced the decision. When everything was finished, I called him. He arrived that evening and stood at the gate for a long time. The old roses remained. So did several hydrangeas and the herb bed. But between them were new beds filled with plants I had chosen. Daniel walked slowly through the garden. Then he looked at me. "It's beautiful. It's mine. I know. I know." The way he said it told me he'd understood the whole thing. The next morning was day 31. For the first time since the flowers began, there was nothing waiting on my porch. Daniel came over around 9 carrying coffee. 2 cups this time. I placed a single white flower beside his. He looked at it. "What's this for?" I thought about Margaret. About my marriage. About 30 mornings spent honoring something finished. Then I looked at the man standing in my new garden. Something that hasn't happened yet. Daniel smiled, and together we walked outside. "You know, after telling you this story, I realized something. Some moments were never meant to be told to everyone. They're too personal, too tender, too close to the heart. And there are still things I've never said out loud. Thoughts I kept to myself. Letters I never sent. Confessions I was too afraid to share here. If you've stayed with me this far, then I think you understand the kind of love I mean. The kind that feels complicated, maybe even forbidden, and yet, somehow, it still reaches a part of you that needs healing. That's why I created something private, a collection called Confessions of Forbidden Love. These aren't just stories. They're the things I couldn't say anywhere else. My private words, my secrets, the emotions that felt too intimate to share in public. And inside that collection, you'll also find a quiet way to connect with me. Because when I wrote those pages, I wrote them as if I were speaking to someone who truly understood me, someone who sees what's hidden beneath the words, someone like you. So if you're ready for the stories that live somewhere between silence, longing, and desire, the private link is waiting for you below, in the comments. And I wouldn't wait too long. Something this personal was never meant to stay open forever. But before you go, after everything you've heard tonight, would you have made the same choice I did? Before you go, I want to ask you something. If you had been in Laura's place, would you have opened your heart to Daniel, knowing part of him would always carry the woman he loved before you? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know what you would have done. And if you enjoy mature romance stories about second chances, unexpected attraction, and the kind of love that finds you when you thought that part of your life was over, subscribe so you don't miss the next confession. If you want to go a little deeper, I've also created a private collection called Confessions of Forbidden Love. It contains the stories, thoughts, and confessions I don't share openly here. You'll find the link below in the comments. And maybe that's the thing about love later in life. Sometimes the most beautiful part isn't what you lost. It's what can still begin on day 31.